If you find that using stock footage doesn't feel very realistic when creating flames and smoke in post, then this VFX breakdown may be of some help. In this video, I'll show you a few of the steps we've taken to create some realistic flames without that disjointed feeling that we can sometimes get when using stock elements. Third Beacon was in charge of 16 visual effects shots in Blue Serif Productions' feature film Something Like Summer. 3 of these shots involved flames and the bits that go with it. We've selected 2 of these shots to break down and talk about. If you've seen our last breakdown covering day for night, you'll know that I go layer by layer here in After Effects, and I'll talk a little bit about each layer, explaining our thought process behind it. As mentioned before, our methods for folder structure and organization will be covered in another video. So this is the end result for VFX Shot 20. And I'll go ahead and show you VFX Shot 19 here. This is Visual Effects Shot 19. It is worth noting that both of these shots are completely ungraded. A large portion of what you see is composed of assets created by our talented friends at ActionVFX. We've purchased and used their assets many times in the past. However, it is worth noting that they were nice enough to send us their new Fire Sparks pack to help pull these shots to the next level free of charge. They have available multiple sets of different resolutions, keyed and unkeyed footage, and for their 3D elements, they actually have multiple render passes so you can composite these exactly as you see fit. They're a stellar team with some amazing tools, and we will continue to support them and believe that you should check them out. Let's start by taking a look at shot VFX 19. Obviously, this is the raw footage. I believe this was shot on a Red Epic, and we have some DPX sequences to work on. And that goes for both of the shots we'll be looking at. As you can see, aside from the raw footage, we have 32 other layers making this composite. Let's go ahead and take a look at this first one. This is called Glow Wrap, and this is just the simple built-in After Effects Glow plugin. And what this does is just add a little bit more brightness and, for lack of a better word, glow to the flames. This will be more evident after color grading, but the light wraps around his head here better than if we just left it like this. So we have 2 glow layers going. There's that one, and then just glow layer, and as you can see, that one does most of the damage here. So if we turn both of those off, you can see how flat the shot looks. Not completely unrealistic, but definitely not what we'd expect. Now, these 2 layers go above this layer, which is footage head mask. I'm going to solo this. As you can see, this is just a really rough mask, outlining his head, feathered quite a bit. And the reason this doesn't need to be perfect is because we're just using it to cut out a bulk of the effects. And then glow wrap is what wraps around that. And we feather this mask quite a lot to simulate the depth of field, because he's very much out of focus, and this kind of just eats away at the fire just a little bit on the edge here. So this layer is, again, a very large feathered mask, and this is underneath the footage head mask, and this just has a Gaussian blur on it, a fairly strong one, and it's not noticeable, but what's going on is it is blurring everything around here, and that also just helps sell the depth of field effect that's going on. So when it does pass in front of the fire, not only does this get covered up a little bit by the footage head mask, but this gets blurred out just a little bit, just a little foggier to really simulate that light kind of wrapping around his head. Now layers 5 and 6 work together. 5 is a track matte for 6, which is a plume of smoke. And this track matte is just very large, heavily feathered, and this just allows the smoke to come into frame only when it's about here. The smoke plume is in 24 frames per second, but it's way too fast for what we need it for. But in order to slow it down and not have it look stuttery, we use time warp. This smoke is set to divide, and what that does is that means it's not going to darken the image as if it's black, thick smoke. It's going to be a lighter smoke. And the reason we went with that is because natural materials burn a white smoke and man-made materials burn black. This also helps to sell the effect that the fire is illuminating everything around it. Medium orange solid 1 is exactly what it sounds like. It's an orange solid. We have this large feathered mask around it, and this is just to help motivate the brightness of the fire. It doesn't flicker, it doesn't move, it's just a big spotlight. And then we have 3 more smoke plumes right here. These are also set to divide to do the same thing. We've got some simple curves on here. You can see that we're really pushing this to the extreme. And that's because when we put it to divide, we wanted a little more contrast. And as you can see, if I solo these, they're all the inverse of what they will become in the composition. Black shadow is exactly that. This is a large area, again, a large mask feathered off, and it's just a black solid. And this is just to help, again, motivate the firelight. We're just enforcing the shadow that was already there. Layer 12 is some turbulent displacement. We have two masks, this large circle, and then this kind of tall shape. And that is because these are both areas of different intensity. The large circle is feathered at 135 pixels, so a pretty intense feather. And then mask 2, this tall shape, is a little more concentrated to simulate the heat coming off of this branch that wouldn't be as wavy or turbulent. And on this turbulent displacement layer, this is an adjustment layer, you can see that we've got two sets of turbulent displacement going. One of them is larger and one of them is a little finer. As you can see by these two keyframes here, we hand keyframe the rising motion using offset to simulate the heat displacement rising, but for evolution we have a simple expression, and that's just time multiplied by 100, and that's just going to keep it changing. It's important to note that you don't just want turbulent displacement to move the fire, you want it to move whatever's behind that. Layer 13 is some dust footage that we had made. I'll go ahead and solo that for you. What we did was tint it kind of an oranger color. We brought the black levels down more so that we could have more contrast as we're screening this into the composite. This also means that we're going to get less particles flowing around. We also have Real Smart Motion Blur on here, and that does exactly what it sounds like. It adds motion blur, but instead of applying motion blur the way After Effects natively does it, where you have to move an entire layer or object, this analyzes each pixel and applies the motion blur to the footage. This is extremely helpful when you're trying to reintroduce motion blur into footage that doesn't have any, such as something with a very high shutter speed. We're going to see Real Smart Motion Blur a lot in this composition. Layers 14 to 20 are assets that we got from ActionVFX.com. So let's take a look at some of the effects we have going on. We have the same effects with slight variations on all of these flames. So first we have curves. I'm going to solo this really quick. We're on blend mode screen. These curves boost the opacity just a little bit, solidifying it. Next, we're using hue and saturation to actually suck out a lot of that color. We're doing this because we're working on a log shot, and that means it's going to be fairly desaturated. So in order to fit in with that, we need to take out some of that color and make sure that the dynamic range is kept intact. Next, we have Real Smart Motion Blur. Let me zoom in here so you can really see this. This is before. This is after. It's at a fairly standard setting, but this is just blurring it a little bit. And the reason we chose this is because if you're shooting at night, you're typically going to have your lens fairly wide open. That, combined with the fact that they're running a normal shutter speed, means there's going to be a fairly natural amount of motion blur. Lastly, we're going to top that off with just a little bit of noise. And this is here to just match the noise and the grain of the camera sensor. You would be surprised at how many effects stick out when you don't apply noise back into them. All of these fire elements combined look a little something like this. It's not the most pretty right now, only because I have this at quarter resolution. You can see some of the masks we have, like this one for the rock. Now you may have noticed that most of these have their blend mode set to screen, but these are set to normal. Different blend modes will give you different effects, different opacities, and blend into your scene differently. And that difference is key. We encourage experimentation with blend modes. It's good to see which works best on what piece of footage in different situations. For instance, these topmost layers are set to screen to allow the back layers of fire to stick through a little more. The back layers of fire are set to normal, and this leaves them a little more robust than the ones in front of it. You can see here on layer 19 that we have one of the new ActionVFX spark bursts. We consider things like this absolutely essential when putting together a composite. It's all of these little details that really tie your scene together and make it believable. If we went through and got rid of all of these separate spark layers, this is what we would have as a composite. Adding them back in, you can see that it makes a world of difference. After layer 20, we have more of these new spark elements in place. It's really nice. They give you different versions of rising sparks, low volume, high volume, spark bursts, sparks in the wind. All of these really help to sell the fire and give it some life. A fire very rarely burns clean, especially when there's a lot of things like dirt, wood chips, or plant life around. And when that happens, it creates sparks and embers. Without those, it'll look more like a man-made fire. With the spark assets, we kind of gave it the same treatment that we did with the fire. We have some curves on here to boost the visibility, hue and saturation to take down the saturation, and real smart motion blur just to make them look a little more drifty. Layer 26 is another orange solid. This is the medium orange solid 1. As you can see, we're kind of going up the bushes here and around the ground and just barely over this rock. And this layer has an expression on its opacity. As you can see, we're using the wiggle expression. This expression is wiggling the value of the opacity, and this is just up against the footage to kind of simulate the fire flicker. In the grand scheme of things, this is actually a fairly subtle effect. Things like this flickering orange layer aren't always necessary. We found that it helped a lot because the on-set lighting is extremely minimal. Layers 27 and 28 are these dirt textures I made. I matched the perspective of the ground in 3D and created these masks around them. I'm using turbulent noise to create some chaotic pattern. It's extremely subtle. We're also running the exact same wiggle expression on the opacity of one of the layers to add some flicker. These are both in here to simulate a texture on the ground. Now, as you can see in the raw footage, this was shot with practical smoke, but not a lot of lighting. And so what this does is it hides the ground. So if we're going to have a light source there, you're going to be able to see the texture of the ground. And that's something that we had to add back in with these two dirt patches. Again, by themselves, looks a little weird, and they're also a little subtle in terms of the entire composition, but it's things like that that really kind of let your effects sit in the reality of the shot. If you look here without it, it looks as if the fire's almost floating. As we enable these two dirt layers, it sticks to the ground. This pre-comp here does the exact same thing as the two dirt layers above it. It's important to realize that sometimes the key to really realistic effects is layering. Sometimes, not all the time, the more you add, the better it'll look. This is most true, we've found, in terms of small details and little flourishes. If you watched our previous breakdown, you'll recognize this technique. Layers 30 and 31 are duplicates of the footage that have been copied and masked out. We use some simple curves to boost the brightness of the midtones, and we have a very similar wiggle expression going on. This is extremely subtle, and I'm pretty sure YouTube won't allow you to see this, but these areas are flickering very subtly. This light pool layer is the exact same thing. That about does it for shot 19. Let's move on to shot 20. I've got to say right off the bat that this is one of the most fun shots I have worked on. There's obviously a lot more movement in this shot. And instead of doing this 2D, we figured we would try it 3D and see what results we'd get with that. The only reason I bring that up is because I haven't had a whole lot of luck with Adobe's 3D camera tracker. Sometimes I end up with things like this. Now, I'm no computer, but I don't see a whole lot of correct information in this. Alright, let's do it again. Let's start at the top here. Footage mask is another duplicate of the exact same footage, and much like in the other composition, this is used to mask out a certain bit. And this is when this character here runs in front of the flames. We set up some markers here. All we did was keep track of our time code, and we brought this into Mocha and rotoscoped him out. Thankfully, he's not in the shot very long. Layer 2 is a tracked null in 3D space. You may notice that it's kind of in a weird spot. It's not on the ground, there's no plane, it's actually on this wooden post. And that's because, although I said the 3D camera tracker worked this time around, that doesn't mean that it didn't come with an extremely difficult fight. As you can see, there aren't many places that the 3D camera tracker picked up on, but boy did it do a good job of tracking that guy's head. Thankfully, we were able to get a 3D camera made off of that track. It just so happens that the most accurate part was this post. So we set the post as the origin, and from there we just pushed everything back in Z space to match. What we've noticed is that the After Effects 3D camera tracker doesn't do such a hot job in conditions of low light and extreme noise. As you may have guessed, this shot is a low light shot and there's a decent amount of noise, so it makes sense that the camera didn't have an easy time finding anything. This is a simple 2D layer with glow on it. As you can see, we just hand tracked a little mask there to follow the flames. No, you are not having deja vu. A lot of this stuff is the exact same as VFX Shot 19. Layers 5 and 6 are footage overlay and footage smog, and both of these are set at different blend modes. Footage overlay is an exact duplicate of the original footage. As you can see, we have it masked out here and feathered, and this is set to darken. And this also has a fairly low opacity of 40. And what this does is this cuts back the intensity of all the effects behind it. Footage smog does the exact same thing, except this tints everything behind it instead of darkening it. This is set to the blend mode color, and that's going to pass through the color information of the original footage. As you can see, the opacity is not full, it's at 80%, and this is so some of the color of the assets can also push through. You can see on set that they had a decent amount of practical smoke, and so in order to blend our effects into that, we need to take in the atmospheric perspective that creates. So this is without those layers. It definitely looks like fire, but it definitely doesn't look like it's in the shot. We have a dust layer here, and this is in 3D space, and this just adds a lot of chaos to the fire. We have it on a screen blend mode, and we have just a bit of blur to simulate the depth of field. Although this is a very, very deep focus, even though we're shrinking down our assets, a lot of things will retain their sharpness, and that is another giveaway to visual effects. Don't be afraid to dirty things up to make them look a little more realistic. Real life is not perfect, so with visual effects, imperfections count for a lot. We have a medium orange solid here, and this is tracked in 3D space with that camera. This is the same thing as the spotlight orange solid in the previous comp, and this just adds a nice glow to the surrounding area. And these two layers are probably my favorite part of this whole composition. These are two layers called pine trees. It's just some shrubbery and pine tree photos that I had taken against a white card. These are set to the darken blend mode, so all of that white disappears, but the actual branches and leaves don't. Both of these layers are pushed a little closer to us in Z space, so that means they're in front of the fire. So as this shot plays out, both of these layers pass in front of the fire, creating a sense of depth and realism, showing that there are branches and pieces of tree in front of the fire as well as behind it. As you can see here with the effects disabled, they stand out quite a lot, so we went ahead and blurred them just to fit them in a little bit more. And then we also use the tint effect. We use the eyedropper to pick up some of the dark smog color here, and that just blends them in a little bit too. Even in the far background, nothing really hits pure black. The blacks are tinted by this smog, and although the other layers do a good job of making up for that, we needed to help it along a little bit with this tint effect. So I'm going to turn it off again. Doesn't work. Turn it on. Beautiful. Again, we've got some simple turbulent displacement here. Layer 12, we've got some more dust. Again, 3D space. This one is screened, pushed in the back by the fire. And now here's something that may have caught your eye. These are called wall fires. These aren't your typical ground fires that you would normally associate with something like this. And these fires were put in place to make it look as if the fire was climbing up the trunks of trees. As you can see, they're a lot taller, they're thinner, and they have more vertical movement. We went ahead and tinted these as well. We desaturated them a bit more. We added some real smart motion blur, camera lens blur just to give that extra depth of field feeling. And of course, we topped that off with noise, because without noise, it's not going to match the camera sensor. And this time we have two smoke plumes, but these are actually set to darken. And that's because the scene already has so much white smog in it. However, the practical smoke that they had on set didn't move upwards as if it was hot. And so we had to add in some more smoke. And that's where these came in. These were also set in 3D space and pushed back by the fire, but pulled forward just a little bit in Z space so that they pass in front of it. Then we have your typical ground fires. We have small fire close, ground fire, and another ground fire, as well as a big fire. Again, we more or less gave them the same treatment as the other comp. Here we have more of their spark assets. We have a mid-volume one and a bursty, windy one, and the bursty, windy one really gives this scene some life. This one is definitely one of the most chaotic fires that they have, and to really catch your eye, we wanted to have the fire be as chaotic as possible in this part. This is a shot or two after the previous shot, so we can assume that the fire has grown, spread to other trees, wind is picking it up, it is becoming wider and taller, and a little more chaotic. And that's why this spark burst is so important. Without it, it looks great, but with it, it's more believable, and it's a hell of a lot scarier. We did end up adding a little bit of blur to these sparks, but we didn't slow them down, so they're extremely fast and very streaky. This is perfect for drawing the viewer's eye back there. This ground light is the exact same trick we used in the previous composition. It's a duplicate of the footage, it's tracked in, a little mask here. This ground light layer also has a wiggle expression to toggle the opacity back and forth. Looking back at these shots, we think that VFX Shot 19 could have been a little different. We would have made some other creative choices on set that day. That aside, it turned out great. VFX 20 we think turned out great. I'm super proud of the work we put into that, and overall the client was extremely satisfied with all of them. Big thanks to ActionVFX for sending over their amazing sparks. Do yourself a favor and check out their website. They've been releasing a ton of various packs, as well as some for free, that can dramatically strengthen your post-production work. Like and share this video with your fellow filmmakers. Comment and reach out. Let us know your thoughts. Did this help you? What are some tricks you use that maybe we haven't? What would you like to see from us? Subscribe to our channel for more tutorials and breakdowns. I'm Kyle Delso at Third Beacon, and I hope you found this information valuable.